The wind cut through the alleys of London like it held a grudge. It smelled of soot ale and coal ash, but beneath it all there was bread, fresh, buttered, unattainable. She could smell it now as she crouched behind the frost-dark railings of Harrington Crescent. Her fingers curled around her shawl like it were spun gold and not a threadbare rag, unraveling at every seam. Her name was Clara Bell, though no one had spoken it kindly in years. 17 winters had passed since her birth in a pauper's bed at St. Giles Infirmary, and no home had kept her longer than a season. Now, with eyes the color of wet ash and a face that still bore the soft curves of youth, she begged by the cobblestones of Grosvenor Square, invisible to every silk-skirted lady and cane-tapping gentleman who passed. Today was no different, until the palace carriage stopped. Not one of the dark liveried supply wagons or curtained diplomat coaches, but the royal state carriage itself, burnished and broad, bearing the crest of House Winsley. It rolled to a halt as if the horses themselves had chosen to stop for her. Clara blinked against the sun, bouncing off its windows. Then the door opened. He stepped down in silence, not needing to speak. His face was clean-shaven, his cheekbones sharp with aristocratic boredom. But his eyes flickered when they met hers, not with pity, but a kind of puzzled interest, like he had stumbled upon a forgotten page in a book and was unsure whether to read or turn away. She expected him to pass. Royalty always did. Instead, Prince Edward, second son of His Majesty King Thomas III, crouched before her, the hem of his embroidered coat brushing mud. "Are you hungry?" he asked. Clara could not reply. Her mouth had gone dry. She thought she might have imagined it, that his voice, calm and noble, had addressed someone else. But no, his gaze held her, steady and disturbingly real. "Yes," she whispered. "I am." He nodded once. "Would you like to eat at the palace?" Behind him, a footman's gloved hand twitched on the door handle, aghast but silent. Clara's world spun. Was it a jest? A trap? A cruel performance for the delight of a prince? But there was no laughter in his face, no smirk. She rose slowly, unsteady on limbs stiff from cold, and followed him to the carriage. The door shut with a muffled click. Gasps echoed faintly from the onlookers. A baker dropped his basket of rolls. A governess clutched a child's shoulder tighter. Inside the velvet-paneled coach, silence enveloped them. He did not look at her again until the carriage was in motion, rumbling through the heart of a city that had never seen her. "You need not speak if you don't wish to," he said simply, "but I will see that you are fed." As rooftops turned to palace gardens, Clara's stomach ached not just from hunger, but from the absurdity of her own presence here, riding beside a prince, reeking of the street. She did not know what waited for her at the palace, or what it would cost, but already she could feel the shift in the air. Someone, somewhere, was going to be very angry. The palace gates did not open. They parted, as if summoned by myth, and Clara felt every eye of every guard like the cold tip of a blade brushing her skin. She wanted to vanish into the carpeted seat, to sink into the velvet and dissolve. But she sat still, shoulders drawn tight, lips pressed together in mute disbelief. It was not the main entrance they approached, but the side portico where less formal guests were received, dignitaries without title, cousins of foreign kings, merchant patrons with too much influence to ignore. Even still, it was marble underfoot, not mud. A butler stood ready, his expression a masterwork of polite revulsion. His gloved hands did not tremble, but Clara saw the tiniest hesitation in his step as he bowed. "Your Highness," he said to Prince, offering no glance at Clara. "Shall I inform Her Grace of your arrival?" Prince Edward shook his head. "There's no need. A meal in the sunroom will suffice. Inform the kitchen I want a full setting laid. And bring Miss... Bell, is it?" He glanced at her. She nodded, speech caught in her throat. "Bring Miss Bell something warm." Immediately, the butler hesitated. That single blink too long, that faint lift of the eyebrow. "As you wish, sir." The door was held open. Clara stepped out. Her shoes, tore at the toe, near splitting at the heel, touched polished palace stone. A maid walking past gasped audibly. Another turned, murmured something behind a gloved hand, and rushed away, skirts whispering like a threat. The sunroom was an ocean of light and glass, with trailing vines and gilt chairs and porcelain birds in flight along the cornice. A table for two had been hastily arranged. Linen, crystal, 3 sets of cutlery. Clara had never seen 3 forks at once before. She sat because she was told to. Her hands trembled in her lap. Soon the room was no longer empty. Ladies in silks wandered past, pretending not to see. A steward lingered longer than necessary, polishing a chandelier that had been polished that morning. 2 minor lords walked the hall outside, casting glances to the arched windows like gawking schoolboys. The meal arrived under silver domes. Roast beef, buttered turnips, sugared pears, rolls so soft she thought they must be soaked in milk. Clara did not eat. Not yet. She looked at Edward. "You're trying to shame someone," she said quietly. He blinked, not offended, but mildly impressed. "No, I'm feeding someone." "But not without notice," she replied. "You brought me here to be seen." He tilted his head. They chose to look. "That's not my doing." Outside the sunroom, a figure appeared, swift, graceful, and icy. Lady Arabella Chalcroft, daughter of the Duchess of Grenford, a woman who had long considered herself promised to Prince Edward by the slow, unspoken agreements of power. She stopped at the window. Her blue eyes locked on Clara's face, then traveled, not subtly, to the girl's hands, her shawl, the shoes. And then, most pointedly, to Edward. Arabella did not smile, but she stepped away, with the deliberate grace of someone already arranging a social execution. Clara finally reached for the bread. The hallways stirred with whispers. Pages ran messages. A lady-in-waiting fainted, though perhaps from tight corsetry. And somewhere in the marble belly of the palace, the queen herself paused at her embroidery frame and frowned. A prince had brought a street girl into the sunroom. The meal had barely begun, but already the walls were listening. She had eaten with her fingers most of her life, not because she was wild or ignorant, but because forks were rare things in the workhouses, and plates even rarer. Clara's first memory of hunger was not of an empty stomach, but her mother cutting a stale loaf into slices so thin the air blew through them. Her mother had died before Clara turned 10. Fever in the bone, or maybe just weariness that finally collapsed her from the inside. There was no funeral, no stone, just a blanket over her still chest and a matron who muttered, "Well, that's one less mouth," before sweeping the space clean for the next. Clara had learned to survive in the liminal spaces of society, behind bakeries, beneath staircases, in alleyways where the smoke didn't reach. She knew how to listen for shoes that meant trouble, how to fold into shadows, how to appear helpful but never visible. And she had never begged, not really. She offered her hands for errands, her arms for laundry, her shoulders for lifting crates. But when the cough had come, she couldn't work. When her last coin had gone to a crust of bread the week before, and the old woman in the bakery had snapped. Not today. Street rat. Clara had sat down beside the railings and closed her eyes. She hadn't expected a prince. She'd expected death. Quiet, cold, the soft descent into something finally still. The memory drifted as the prince lifted a cup to his lips. "You're not what I expected," he said, his voice mild, as though commenting on the weather. Clara looked at him. "And what was I meant to be?" "A beggar. A girl who'd cry and tremble and declare eternal loyalty because someone gave her a plate of lamb." "I am a beggar," she replied without shame. "But I won't cry because someone remembered I'm human." He stared at her, unreadable, then leaned back in his chair. "You knew hunger early," he said. "You carry it like a shadow." Clara didn't answer. Instead, she broke a piece of roll and slipped it into her pocket. She had not forgotten the alley. She had not forgotten the others. He saw it and said nothing. But as she sat among the cut crystal and embroidered napkins, surrounded by a palace that breathed judgment, she realized something else. This was not the first time she had been in a noble house. Years ago, when she was barely 12, she had been taken in for a fortnight by a merchant's widow who mistook her for a war orphan. The house had smelled of cinnamon and ink. Clara had swept those halls, polished brass stair rods, and once, by accident, stepped into the parlor while a gentleman caller was present. The widow's rage had been immediate. "You filthy thing! You do not belong where silk breathes. Clara had been thrown into the snow that evening, a single crust of bread tossed after her like a joke. And now, silk surrounded her again. But this time she had been invited. Across the room, servants passed quietly, pretending not to notice. But she could feel it. The weight of their glances, the words that would echo in kitchens by nightfall. The prince and the street girl. At luncheon. Alone. Clara wasn't naive. She knew kindness from power always came with a price. But she also knew something else. They had all seen her now. And once seen, she could never be truly invisible again. She had not planned for this moment. No one could. But Clara Belle had prepared all her life for the quiet shift between silence and consequence. The palace air was heavy with inquiry. The butlers moved more briskly. Footmen lingered outside the sunroom with exaggerated disinterest. Servants were conduits of the nobility's nerves, and the temperature among them had turned suddenly watchful. Clara felt it most in the glances, the lowered voices, the tremor of a silver tray as it was set before her with too much care. But there was one person who did not look away. Martha, a palace maid no older than Clara herself, stood at the far end of the corridor. She bore the livery of the lesser staff, her hands red from scouring, her bonnet askew, and when Clara caught her eye, the girl gave a single furtive nod, so quick it could have been a tick, a twitch, anything. Yet Clara knew the language of invisible girls. Martha had been in the kitchens when she arrived. Clara had seen her gaze dart toward the door, then toward the stairwell beyond. And now she lingered, not for spectacle, but as someone who recognized a shift in balance. Perhaps, too, someone who longed to see the weight tip. Later that day, when the plates were cleared and Prince Edward summoned away by a discreet whisper from his equerry, Clara was left alone in the sunroom. Alone but not unattended. A man approached, not a servant, not nobility. He wore a coat that had once been fashionable, now frayed at the cuffs, and shoes so well polished they betrayed his pride. He bowed slightly. "Miss Belle," he said, his voice like soft gravel. "My name is Mr. Harwood. I am solicitor to His Highness. I have been asked to prepare something should the matter of your appearance here provoke consequences." Clara blinked. Consequences. The man smiled faintly, not unkindly. "In this house, miss, everything has consequences." He handed her a folded document. She did not unfold it, but her fingers closed around the paper as though it were a shield. "What is it?" she asked. "An affidavit, if necessary. Your invitation was voluntary, your person unblemished, your dignity intact. Witnessed by 3 members of staff and 1 guard. It protects you should the Queen's court choose to interpret your presence harshly." "Does that often happen?" she asked. Mr. Harwood tilted his head. "What do you think?" She thought of the way the footmen's spines had stiffened, how the ladies had whispered in corners, how even the prince's face had seemed just a bit too still when Arabella appeared at the window. Clara folded the document slowly, carefully. "And what do you require from me?" "Nothing," he said, "except your silence. And perhaps your patience." She said nothing. But her silence was not passive. It rang with the unspoken question. What storm is he preparing me for? That night, Clara did not sleep in the palace. She was not offered a room. But she was not sent to the streets, either. Instead, she was escorted by Mr. Harwood to a small guest house on the edge of the gardens. It smelled of rosemary and old stone, and though the mattress was thin, the sheets were clean. A gown had been left for her. Plain but new. A servant's dress, perhaps, yet not stained with labor, not stitched with condescension. Clara did not cry. She had cried all her tears years ago. But as she lay beneath the linen sheets, hands folded across her chest, she whispered the names of the girls she had known and lost. Elsie, who froze beside a baker's stall. Rose, who vanished one night after following a lord's carriage. Liddy, who had simply stopped waking. She whispered their names like a vow. Whatever was coming, she would not be erased. Not this time. The invitation was handwritten, heavy parchment, sealed with a royal crest. Delivered by footman at dawn. Clara stared at it as if it might burn her fingers. The ink was impeccable, the message brief. Miss Clarabelle is requested to attend luncheon in the Royal East Gallery. Guests of standing will be present. Appropriate attire will be provided. She read it twice, then laid it down without touching her tea. The storm had begun. By midday, Clara stood before a tall mirror wearing a gown the color of stone and cloud, modest in cut, without ornament, but well-tailored enough to speak volumes. Her hair had been combed and pinned back by a silent maid. No rouge, no perfume, no lace. She looked not like a royal guest nor a servant, but something in between, an enigma waiting to be defined. She was led to the East Gallery by the same Martha from the day before, who did not speak, but gave her arm a gentle squeeze just before opening the door. The room was full. Lady Arabella was already seated, a frozen bloom of resentment in sky-blue silk. Beside her, her mother, the Duchess of Grenford, stood with her back straight, mouth tight, and gaze sharpened by years of diplomacy. Several lords in waistcoats turned as Clara entered. A few narrowed their eyes. One chuckled. Clara felt the weight of every glance as she crossed the marble floor. Prince Edward stood by the window. His expression was unreadable, but when his gaze met Clara's, he gave a small nod, not encouragement, not pride, merely acknowledgement, a shared understanding. She took her seat at the far end of the table. The conversation resumed, falsely polite. Lady Arabella was the first to strike. "What a curious guest we welcome today," she said, her voice light but ringing, and without even a surname to accompany her. "The palace has become quite democratic. Has it not, Your Highness?" A few quiet titters followed. The Duchess smiled into her glass. Prince Edward turned to Clara. "Do you wish to answer that?" Clara met Arabella's gaze, then the Duchess's, and then looked down the table. She had nothing to protect but her dignity, and nothing left to fear. "I have a name. Clarabelle," she said. "As to my place at this table, I was invited, as were you." A rustle moved through the guests, the kind that follows an unsanctioned remark. The air shifted. Clara had spoken aloud. The Duchess raised her brows. "And how, may I ask, did you come to be in such favor with His Highness?" The prince did not interrupt. Clara spoke clearly. "I was hungry. He offered me a meal. That is all." "Indeed," Lady Arabella said coldly. "And now you dine in the East Gallery." "Yes," Clara said. "The path from pavement to palace is short if one is willing to notice the person curled upon it." Silence. Then, from the far end of the table, a new voice spoke. "I can confirm Miss Bell's account," said Mr. Harwood, the prince's solicitor, who had entered unnoticed. "She was invited as a guest. There is no scandal, no deceit, only hospitality, extended to one who needed it." He reached into his coat and produced a folded affidavit, which he laid gently on the table before the Duchess. Lady Arabella paled. Prince Edward lifted his glass. "This kingdom will endure many things, but it will not crumble because I shared a meal with a hungry girl." And then, as the servants began to pour the wine, another sound broke the brittle tension. Applause. It was soft, singular, and entirely unexpected. It came from Lord Ashbury, a minor earl known more for his hunting dogs and his wit. He clapped once, then again. "About time someone in this palace remembered what nobility is for," he said, reaching for his bread. The room shifted again, this time toward uncertainty. The unraveling had begun, not of Clara, but the social tapestry that had tried to exclude her. And Clara? She lifted her fork, hands steady. Let them see. Let them witness. The luncheon ended, but the tremors it sent through the palace did not. Within hours, the Duchess of Grenford summoned a private audience with the Queen's Chamberlain. Within minutes after that, the Queen's lady-in-waiting, Lady Frances Holloway, wrote to the bishop's wife about the shameless moral theater that had unfolded in the East Gallery. By sundown, 5 of the court's lesser nobles had excused themselves from scheduled appearances, citing sudden illness or inconvenient travel. It was a polite form of protest, a withdrawal of presence, not a declaration. Clara was not escorted back to the guest house that evening. She was brought, shadowed by 2 guards whose silence was not protection, but warning. She walked behind them like a ghost returning from scandal. When the door closed behind her, She found Mr. Harwood already waiting, seated in the same stiff chair by the hearth. "They're circling," he said without preamble. "Like wolves?" Clara asked, easing down into the chair opposite him. "Like worse," he replied. "Bored aristocrats." She folded her hands in her lap. "What will they do?" "They will attempt to discredit you. Quietly, viciously. They'll find someone to say you were a thief, a temptress, a liar, perhaps all three. They'll hint you were seen outside a gentleman's club, whether you were or not. Someone will recall a girl with your eyes who ran away from a house with missing silver. It won't matter what's true. What matters is what sticks." Clara nodded. "And when it sticks, you become their excuse, not just for ignoring you, but for punishing the prince." She exhaled slowly. "And what will he do?" Harwood's expression didn't change. "He'll be called to account. Perhaps not formally, but the Queen will summon him. She'll ask if this was rebellion, infatuation, or something worse. Politics." "I didn't ask for any of this," Clara murmured. "No, but you accepted the bread," he said. "And now they'll make you swallow the rest." A soft knock interrupted them. It was Martha, the maid, again, flushed, breathless. She curtsied quickly. "I've been dismissed," she whispered. "They said I stared too long during the luncheon." Clara stood. "You were fired?" Martha nodded. "They sent me out the back. No wages, no references." Before Clara could speak, Martha reached into her apron and pulled out something folded and small. A letter. She handed it to Mr. Harwood. "I found it in the Duchess's receiving room. It's not addressed, but I saw the seal. It was half burned in the grate." Harwood unfolded the page, scanning. His jaw tightened. "It's a note from Arabella, to the bishop's secretary. She planned the insult before you even arrived. Asked him to circulate a tale about you winking at the footmen and sneaking into the West Wing." Clara's cheeks burned, not with shame, but with fury. She meant to ruin me before I even spoke. Harwood gave a tight nod. "We can't destroy the Duchess, but we can hold the rope when she trips over her own arrogance." He handed the note back to Martha. "Hide this. Keep it until I ask. And stay hidden yourself." Martha slipped out, vanishing as quickly as she came. The retaliation had begun, but Clara was no longer alone. She had the truth and witnesses, quiet, loyal, invisible girls like herself who had nothing left to lose. And so, for the first time in her life, Clara did not tremble at the sound of elite anger. She welcomed it, because power had turned to face her, and it could no longer pretend not to see. The Queen summoned Prince Edward to the inner drawing room 3 days later. No retinue, no pageantry, only her personal secretary, the flicker of firelight and the thick, suffocating silence of a monarch disappointed not by scandal, but by disobedience. "You have brought shame to the House of Winsley," she said calmly, without lifting her eyes from her embroidery hoop. Edward did not respond immediately. He stood in perfect posture, as he had been taught, hands behind his back, his breath even. "I invited a girl to lunch," he said. "You invited filth into the veins of the realm," she snapped, setting down the hoop at last. "A nobody, worse than that, a girl who spoke back, and now the court trembles with rumors of your reformist leanings. Are you seeking to replace your father before his time?" His eyes hardened just a touch. "I offered kindness." The Queen leaned forward. "You offer position through kindness. That is not mercy. It is treasonous sentiment. That girl has now become a conversation. You've turned a nameless orphan into a wedge between me and the dukedoms I spent decades binding into loyalty." He said nothing. "She must leave," the Queen finished. "You will escort her personally to the edge of the city. Make it seem as if she chooses to go. If she refuses, make her. She will not sleep in our walls again." Elsewhere in the palace, Clara sat on the edge of a polished chaise in an antechamber, not meant for guests of any rank. A servant girl stood guard, her eyes downcast. Another, young, uncertain, brought a tray with nothing but water. Clara drank slowly. She knew what the silence meant, but it was not fear she felt. Not entirely. It was grief, a grief she had not dared consider until now, because she had allowed herself, somewhere between the bread and the marble floors, to believe that something real might exist in the gaze of the prince. Not love, she was not so foolish, but recognition, that someone had seen her, not as a spectacle or cause, but as a person. The door opened. Edward entered. Alone, she stood. For a moment, they did not speak. Then, "She's sending me away, isn't she?" Clara said, "Yes. And you're delivering the message yourself." "I asked to." Clara's throat closed. He walked forward. "You're not dismissed. You're not disgraced. But if you remain, they will not rest until you are unmade. I can't protect you inside these walls." She looked up at him. "You never promised to." "No, but I hoped," she whispered, her voice shaking, "that someone might." He exhaled, his jaw clenched. "I can send you to a safe estate in Devonshire. I'll arrange." "No," her voice was firm now. "I don't want exile and silk. I want the truth." He stared at her. "You're the only truth I've seen in 10 years. Silence stretched between them like fabric pulled too tightly. And then something in him faltered. "I'm sorry," he said. It wasn't enough, but it was honest. Clara walked past him toward the door, then walked me to the gates. Not in secret, not as a favor, as a farewell. He followed, and as they walked to the palace halls, every footman, every lady, every lord turned to watch, not out of curiosity, but because they sensed something final in the air, a line being drawn, a wound being made. Outside, the carriage waited. Clara stepped into it without a word, but just before the door closed, she looked back, not at the palace, not at the guards, at him, and in that glance, he saw every consequence of kindness, and every scar being almost loved. The wheels turned, and the court watched the street girl ride away, silent, unbroken, unforgettable. Rain began to fall just as the carriage passed beneath the eastern gate. Not a storm, just a soft, persistent drizzle that blurred the view of London's cobblestones and silvered the world in a melancholy sheen. Clara watched droplets chase each other down the glass pane, her hand unmoving on her lap. She did not cry. She would not give the city her tears. The carriage was modest, but clean. A wool cloak lay folded beside her, placed there by someone who understood she owned nothing but the clothes she wore. No one had spoken as she departed, not even Edward after helping her into the seat. He had bowed, like she was still a guest, and shut the door himself. Now the palace was behind her, and with it the whispers, the cutlery, the ghost of roasted pears. But ahead, there was still her name. The driver turned not toward the river districts, nor toward the charity wards, but west toward Chelsea. When the carriage stopped, Clara opened the door herself. The house before her was small but handsome. Ivy crept along the gate. The chimney smoked, gently, like someone had stoked a fire just an hour ago. A sign hung above the door, hand-carved and elegant. Miss Fairley's School for Girls. She blinked. A young maid opened the door before Clara could knock. "You're expected," she said with a nervous smile. Inside, the air smelled of chalk lavender and fresh bread. Girls' voices echoed from a room upstairs, reading lessons aloud. A governess in brown passed silently, offering only a glance at Clara's dress, her hair, her worn shoes, then nodding, ever so slightly, with recognition. Miss Fairley herself met her at the study door. Tall, gray-haired, and regal in a plain black dress, she extended a hand. "I was informed by Mr. Harwood that you possess a sound mind, clear handwriting, and an uncommon sense of dignity under pressure. That is more than I can say for many who come through my doors." Clara didn't know what to say. "You'll begin in the office," Miss Fairley continued, "sorting correspondence, managing the ledger, tutoring the youngest in reading if your skills are strong. Lodging included, privacy respected, gossip prohibited. And the pay?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "A fair wage. We do not exploit the intelligent here." For a moment, Clara simply stood still, the air strange in her lungs. She had expected silence, dismissal, a door to close behind her for good. Instead, This was a door opening. She stepped inside. Later that week, the newspapers carried a small but pointed item in the society column. It seems the younger prince has taken a political turn, championing education for the unwashed. An unnamed lady of humble origins has reportedly been placed in an esteemed Chelsea institution. The Queen's response remains delightfully unrecorded. No official statement was issued by the Crown, but in certain circles, whispers turned to silence, not out of boredom, but discomfort, because the girl had not vanished. She had chosen to walk through a different gate, and she had not begged. She had been seen, not as scandal, not as charity, but as a future someone could not quite erase. The palace never uttered her name again. Not in council meetings, not at teas, not even in quiet reprimands whispered between mothers and daughters. But Clara Belle lingered all the same. In the months that followed, invitations were declined without explanation. A minor baroness canceled her daughter's engagement to a Grenfell cousin, citing an atmosphere of instability. And in the Queen's drawing room, a tapestry long hanging above the fireplace, embroidered by Arabella's own hand, was quietly removed, replaced with a somber landscape of the Scottish Highlands. No reason was given. Lady Arabella, once the darling of court, found her name missing from a key list of dinner guests invited to Windsor in spring. Her mother, the Duchess, sent 3 letters demanding clarification and received none. Reputation was not lost in shouts. It withered in silence. Meanwhile, at Miss Fairley's School for Girls, Clara carved out a life with slow precision. She woke at 6, lit the stoves, opened the shutters. She reviewed the pupils' penmanship, corrected arithmetic, taught the littlest ones to spell their names. In the evenings, she copied ledgers in neat, measured script by candlelight, her fingers ink-stained, her back straight. And every Sunday, without fail, she received a letter, always unsigned, always addressed simply to Miss Seabell. The contents were brief. Weather updates, a new book recommendation, the success of a petition to improve factory conditions near Bristol, backed discreetly by a supporter who believes in visible people. No promises, no poetry, but every envelope with a royal seal in a corner, so faint it could be missed by anyone not looking for it. She never wrote back, but she kept them all in a tin box beneath her bed. One day, she found a folded note hidden between the pages of her ledger. It was written in a hand too careful to be a child's. Martha's, you did not fall. You changed direction. You are the echo they cannot stop hearing. That night, Clara stood by the window of her small room and looked out at the street, where lanterns flickered and rain polished the stones. She thought of the palace gates, the East Gallery, the bread in her pocket, the cold eyes that had once tried to strip her bare. And she thought of Edward, not with longing, not with regret, but with a strange, steady understanding. He had opened the door. She had chosen to walk through it. Now, the world beyond that door had begun to shift, subtly, quietly, just enough to make space for someone like her. Not everywhere, not loudly, but in whispers, letters, and empty chairs at noble tables. The girl from the street had not destroyed the palace. She had simply reminded it that the ground beneath its walls was not so far from the street after all. Years passed. The schoolhouse changed only in the smallest ways. Fresh coats of paint, new slates, a broader garden for girls to play in. But inside, within the low stone walls and the scent of ink and tea, Clara's presence shaped every room. Her voice was soft, but her rules unyielding. No child would go hungry, no hand would be struck, and no girl would be told she was less because of where she came from. They called her Miss Bell now, with respect, with affection. And every girl who passed through those doors learned not just her letters but her worth, and how to hold her head high even when the world bent to push it down. On a gray morning in late autumn, a carriage arrived, unmarked, unannounced. The driver wore navy livery, but no crest. He carried only a letter and a parcel, both sealed in wax. The letter read, I have asked nothing more of you. I will never ask. But should you wish it, the door remains open. Yours, always, E. Clara did not cry. She had not wept since that day at the palace gates. She placed the letter in the tin box with the others and did not open the parcel until evening, after the girls had gone to bed. Inside was a single item, a book. On the virtue of dignity, essays by the forgotten, the first page bore an inscription in familiar, even script, for the girl who reminded a kingdom how to kneel without shame and how to rise without permission. Years later, when Miss Bell died quietly in her sleep, surrounded by former pupils and staff, the city did not mark the date. No bells rang. No court mourning was observed. But at Miss Fairley's school, every girl wore a black ribbon for a week. And on her desk, they left her ledger open to a blank page. The palace made no statement. But in the East Gallery, where Clara had once eaten in silence, a new painting appeared among the landscapes and naval victories, a small canvas, and signed. It depicted a rain-washed street, a broken gate, and a girl walking alone with a roll of bread in her hand. Visitors rarely asked about it, but those who had seen, really seen, lingered just a little longer in that room. And still, no one dare mention her name again, but every room remembered her,